All right, this is Joel Anderson's second rebuttal. I see something here to make sure I'm in frame. This is Joel Anderson's second rebuttal in the Noah's flood debate. So let's get right to it. In this rebuttal, I will be attempting to do the following. 1, clarify my position regarding Genesis 6 through 9 and address some of the questions that both Jen and a few others have raised. 2, give a few more observations and questions regarding Jen's position and presentation. And 3, give a few more observations and questions regarding Robert's position and presentation. So let's get right to it. I've only got 5 pages. Clarifications. First, when I say Genesis 6 through 9 as well as 1 through 11 is a myth, I'm simply referring to its ancient genre. I'm not saying it isn't true. I am saying the purpose of those chapters is not to give historical information, but rather to articulate Israel's convictions and beliefs about God, mankind, and his purposes in creation and history. They are the worldview lenses through which it is possible to understand God's involvement in history. Second, it is also important to emphasize Genesis 1 through 11 isn't exactly like ancient Near Eastern mythology. It ends up doing something very different. In addition to subverting the pagan worldview of the ancient Near East, it also links up to actual history, starting in the story of Abraham. If I could put it another way, if pagan ancient Near Eastern myths were used to justify the dismissing of mankind as useless, Genesis 1 through 11 is used to emphasize the dignity and worth of human beings and to lay the foundation for the telling of history. Third, when I say that Genesis 6 through 9 is in the genre of myth, I'm not saying that there couldn't have been some kind of flood in the ancient Near East that was the impetus for the creating of the story. That being said, I do not think Genesis 6 through 9 should be read as a historical documentary. So simply put, is Genesis 6 through 9 a historical account of a literal worldwide flood? There's no evidence of that. Is Genesis 6 through 9 a historical account of a literal local flood? There's no evidence of that either. Is Genesis 6 through 9 a mythological story that could have been inspired by an actual flood at some point in the ancient Near East? I think that's the most likely option. Responding to some objections. Contrary to what Jen claimed, my idea is anything but new and novel. In fact, I'm insisting that we should read Genesis 6 through 9 in its original historical context of the ancient Near East. And in the ancient Near East, they didn't write histories. They weren't contemplating 21st century scientific questions. This isn't even in dispute. I'm not scoffing at the history of the Bible at all. I'm acknowledging the kind of writing the people of the ancient Near East employed, and I'm saying we cannot impose our modern assumptions back onto the biblical text. And so, for Jen's question regarding how I determine Genesis 1 through 11 isn't historical, but everything else after it is, let me say the following. First, much of Genesis 1 through 11, and Genesis 6 through 9 in particular, looks a lot like other ancient Near Eastern stories that we have already categorized as myth. Second, as soon as we get to Abraham in Genesis 12, we are bombarded with names of regions and places that we know exist. And the progression of time slows way down. Abraham alone gets 13 chapters devoted to him. And even those chapters cover less than 100 years. By contrast, virtually nothing in Genesis 1 through 11 can be located or verified, and supposedly thousands of years pass in the blink of an eye. That's not what histories do. Second, what about the genealogical question, both the genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 as well as those in Matthew and Luke? This can be a complicated topic, but I have to be brief. I already explained the purpose of the genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 in my opening presentation. They are literary constructs to tease out the theme of the War of the Offspring in Genesis 3, and they serve to link the mythological stories in Genesis 1 through 11 to actual history in Genesis 12. The only thing even resembling this is the Sumerians' king list. In it is claimed that kingship descended from heaven and that the ancient kings lived thousands of years, and then after the flood, the lives of the kings get shorter. I think the genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 are a take on this, with some key differences. The The Sumerian kings list was meant to justify the rule of kings. The only thing that mattered were the kings who came from the gods, supposedly. Humanity as a whole was worthless. By contrast, the genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 show that humanity matters. God created humanity, Adam, in his image to be kingly priests of his creation, and he promised to use humanity to defeat death. Now, the next obvious question is, well, where does actual history begin? If Abraham was historical, then was his father Terah, was his grandfather Nahor historical? Where does myth end and history begin? We want a line. Well, my simple answer is, I don't know. And I'm okay with that. The fact is simply that the ancients used these types of things in a different way than we assume. Somehow it gets linked in. We have to leave it at that. Third, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jesus, and the author of Hebrews and Peter do not speak of Noah as historical. They make reference to the Noah story to highlight certain prophetic and theological points, but mere allusion or referencing to Genesis 6 through 9 does not automatically entail a historical claim. We don't know what they were thinking in those terms. I know some like to point to Luke's genealogy because he takes the line of Jesus all the way back to Adam, and therefore Adam and Noah must be historical. This, though, is a misunderstanding of the purpose of the genealogies in Luke and Matthew. Matthew's genealogy goes back through the kings of Judah and David and goes back to Abraham, because Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience and is making the claim that Jesus is the Davidic king and the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, the father of the Jews. Luke, though, although he includes David and Abraham, he doesn't even go through the royal lineage, and he goes all the way back to Adam. Luke's audience is Gentile. Therefore, he doesn't emphasize the Davidic royal line at all. Luke's emphasis is to show that Jesus is the Savior of all humanity. Thus, he uses the genealogy from Genesis 1 through 11 that goes all the way back to Adam, because Adam represents all humanity. Simply put, if you try to use Luke's genealogy as historical proof of Genesis 1 through 11, then you're faced with a big problem. It is totally different than Matthew's genealogy. And no, one does not go through Mary while the other one goes through Joseph. You look at them both. They both purport to go through Joseph. So basically, you are faced with a choice. Either insist that the genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 are strictly historical, and thus you have to be forced to acknowledge that there is a huge contradiction between Matthew and Luke, or acknowledge that both the writer of Genesis as well as Matthew and Luke are using their genealogies in a different way than we in the modern world assume. Fourth, why specific dates throughout Noah's flood? Well, it's an element of storytelling. For example, some numbers, like the 40 days and 40 nights, are highly symbolic and run throughout the Bible. 40 years in the wilderness, Moses on Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah taking 40 days and 40 nights to travel to Sinai, the people of Nineveh fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. These are symbolic numbers. Fifth, why would God use the genre of myth to convey truth and subvert the pagan worldview found in ancient Near Eastern myths? Well, why not? If the ancient Israelites were living in a culture in which myth was used to convey beliefs and worldviews, why wouldn't God use the literary genre that they were familiar with? That's a hard word to say. Familiar with. Sixth, are myths really historical? Well, the answer to that is no. There is simply no historical evidence for that. Jen's speculation that Gilgamesh could have been a historical story after the Noah story with fake news sprinkled in, well, it simply flies in the face of reality. Gilgamesh and Atrahasis are dated much earlier than the Noah story. On top of that, I simply do not know anyone who considers ancient Near Eastern mythology, or Greek or any mythology, to be attempting to do history. No one believes Pandora opened a literal box at one point in history. No one believes Marduk killed a literal sea serpent at one point in history, etc., etc. Simply put, I think that it is simply obvious that when it comes to Genesis 6 through 9 and Genesis 1 through 11 as a whole, that the literary genre is that of ancient Near Eastern myth, all the while emphasizing that what Genesis 1 through 11 is actually teaching is radically different at every level than the ancient Near Eastern worldview. That's where we start, by understanding the most basic level what kind of writing it is. After we acknowledge that, we can then move on to the next question. Can Genesis 6 through 9 also be relating a historical event? And at the end of my opening presentation, I said maybe, but it is up to Jen and Robert to make that argument. And the fact is, if Genesis 6 through 9 is also historical, then we should expect to find historical scientific evidence for it. As of yet, though, Jen has not provided any evidence for a worldwide flood. Robert has provided evidence that there have been historical floods throughout the region of Mesopotamia in the past, but I've yet to see anything presented that would suggest Genesis 6 through 9 is essentially a historical documentary about a certain Mesopotamian man named Noah who survived a Mesopotamian flood. Now, the fact that Robert has had no problems with my opening presentation and seemingly agrees with my assessment of Genesis 1 through 11, perhaps I'm misunderstanding precisely what his view is. We'll see. Questions for Jen. And that brings me to my fundamental question problem with Jen's presentation thus far. She hasn't articulated the particulars of her position, and she hasn't put forth any actual evidence for a worldwide flood. There isn't much really to critique because there hasn't been anything put forth. She's claiming that Genesis 6 through 9 is basically a historical account of a worldwide flood. Fine. But then she implied she doesn't believe the flood happened 4,000 years ago, but then she claims the Tower of Babel was around 2240 BC. Okay, but can we have some more actual articulated positions and evidence? Up to this point, I feel the majority of her position is angels had sex with women, the Nephilim were demigods, and Noah had a big boat and spent most of his time cleaning up animal poop. And so, I'd appreciate some specifics. Two things. A, when do you think the worldwide flood happened? And B, what specific evidence in the natural world points to a literal worldwide flood? Let me get things started with a specific scientific objection to the notion of a worldwide flood. Now, typically, the claim is that the worldwide flood was so violent and catastrophic that it was the cause for the buried fossils and rock layers we have today all around the world. Well, when I look at the geological column, I see layers and layers of sediment piled on top of each other with clear differences in the layers. I also see that all modern human fossils are located in the top layer. And all dinosaur fossils are located in many, many, many layers further down the geological column. And below them, much further down, other types of creatures that cannot be found in any other layers. So, if there was a worldwide flood that was the cause for all this, I have a hard time thinking the result would be such an orderly laying down of various sediments and an orderly deposit of various fossils within the specific sedimentary layers. Now, if I had the time, I'd make a video of the following demonstration. Imagine me with a giant blender, and that blender is located in a large bowl. I put in the blender various things, peanut butter, syrup, cereal, ice cubes, maybe even some dirt and some grass, just about anything. In addition, I throw in various small plastic figures like army men and barnyard animals, sea creatures and dinosaur type things. So I put it all in there, then I turn the blender on high, and then in the middle of the blending, I take the top off and let everything just explode out of the blender and into the bowl. Now, what are the chances that all the peanut butter just naturally was layered in perfectly at the bottom, followed by ice cubes, then the cereal, then the syrup, then the dirt and the grass? And what are the chances that all the army figures just happen to be deposited in the dirt, while all the barnyard animals found their way to the syrup layer, and the sea creatures encased in ice, and the dinosaurs enveloped in peanut butter? I think you get my point. If there was really a catastrophic global flood 4,000 years ago or whenever, we most certainly would not have the kind of sedimentary and fossil layers that we in fact have. The fact is, the geological scale and the fossil layers are literally rock-solid proof against the notion that a singular worldwide catastrophic flood was the cause of it all. I have one final observation about Jen's rebuttal. I found it interesting that she used the population growth depicted in Exodus as the model to explain worldwide population growth. Now, Exodus makes it clear that the fertility of Israel in Egypt was exceptional because God was blessing his people in this way. Simply put, that rate wasn't put forth as normal and expected. Not only that, but I find it odd that she then uses that exceptional birth rate in a very uniform fashion to calculate worldwide population growth rates, despite the fact that she makes it abundantly clear that she is highly skeptical of using the concept of uniformity with respect to the past. Questions for Robert. First, I would like to thank Robert for agreeing with me and realizing that nothing I said was wrong. He is truly a wise man. That being said, I am a bit confused basically over one thing. If Robert agrees with my take on the genre of Genesis 1 through 11 being that of myth, I'm not understanding his claims that Genesis 6 through 9 is essentially a historical documentary of a real man named Noah and a local Mesopotamian flood. Or is Robert basically saying that the same thing I'm saying, namely that there probably was an actual flood at some point in Mesopotamia that served as the impetus for the creation of the story in Genesis 6 through 9. I am simply unclear on precisely what his local flood position is in regard to this. So I'd like clarification. Now, the thing I appreciated most in Robert's rebuttal, obviously, was his articulation of the biblical writer's use of ancient Near Eastern mythological imagery and language. It's so good I want to repeat it. It shouldn't surprise us that the biblical writers use terms, symbols, and concepts derived from popular mythology to address their audiences. It is crucial to observe that the use of such concepts did not obligate any biblical writer to adopt the theological mindset of their sources. Where the language of myth was countenanced in the Old Testament writings, it carried with it a very different meaning for Israel than for the pagan nations of the ancient Near East. As a literary phenomenon, the usage of mythological allusions is widespread in many later cultures, and the fact that such references might appear in literary productions is no indication that the writer is necessarily committed to any underlying theology, or that he does more than merely approve of the suitability of the allusion as part of the process of human communication. It also implicitly demonstrates that Yahweh is not bound to any particular means of communicating his message. Amen. He is sovereign even over the polytheistic myths that would deny his uniqueness. This sovereignty is demonstrated most fully when biblical writers attribute to Yahweh in greater degree the positive characteristics of the other ancient Near Eastern gods. Bravo. I like it. That is precisely my point. At the very least, we should be able to acknowledge the ancient Near Eastern genre, language, and imagery that Genesis 6 or 9 and 1 through 11 has. And it shouldn't surprise us or shock us at all. After all, ancient Israel was part of the ancient Near East. Why wouldn't they write and communicate in the way people living in the ancient Near Eastern world wrote and communicated? But again, that takes me back to my confusion on Robert's position. So take, for instance, the issue of Genesis 1. Scholars have long noted that there's a clear Hebraic parallel structure in the 6 days of creation. To simplify things, it looks like this. In the first 3 days, God separates things into various spheres of existence. Think like boxes. And then in the second 3 days, God fills each box with various things, and they correlate to each other. So you have day 1, separation between light and darkness. Day 4, he puts the sun, moon, and stars in it. Day 2, he separates, there's a separation between the waters above and the waters below. Day 5, he puts the birds in the air and the sea creatures in the sea. Day 3, there's a separation between the sea and the land. Day 6, what do you get? Land animals and mankind. There's a perfect structure to it. there is a clear literary structure to the entire chapter. That is indisputable. So why would we think that Genesis 1 is also trying to convey scientific information as to how the world was literally created? Robert is correct when he says that the laws and constants of physics have operated invariably and continuously throughout cosmic history. But what does that have to do with the ancient Near Eastern creation story that is clearly set up in a poetic fashion? That's my question. Now, although the comments from both Jen and Robert about the Tree of Life were interesting, I feel it's not really on the topic at hand regarding Noah's flood. Sure, I think one can see certain poetic parallels between the Tree of Life and the cross. In fact, when I was in my 20s, I wrote a rather long T.S. Eliot-like poem called The Seven Circles of Eternity's Garden. And in it, I used this imagery. In circle 1, the main image was the Tree of Life, with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil acting kind of like its shadow. Grasping for that led to darkness and emptiness. And then in circle 4, right in the middle of the poem, the main images were the olive tree in Gethsemane and the cross of Calvary. And then finally in circle 6, the main image was the tree of life in the new creation. So my point, both with this as well as everything in Genesis 1 through 11, is that these stories are creative and poetic at their core. They evoke questions of meaning and purpose and existence, and they invite us to enter into them, contemplate them, and let them shape our perspective and understanding of the world. That is where they live, breathe, and have their inspired power to change lives. We miss all that when we get sidetracked into trying to prove they are historical or scientifically accurate. Besides, I have yet to see any actual evidence that would suggest Genesis 6 through 9 is essentially a historical documentary of either a worldwide or local flood.